Welcome back to Incremental, the continuous improvement podcast. This is our concepts edition for the week. I'm Devin Bedoni.
And I'm Uriel Eisen.
You want to hit us with that quote?
Yes. The only thing worse than running your car is not running it. Source unknown. Alicia told me that this weekend. Kind of cracked me up because I guess because of the inherent contradiction in that.
Yeah.
And I think that's sort of maybe the theme of the episode here.
The episode or just the show?
Well, both, I guess. Yeah, there's a lot of contradictory ideas.
I feel like it's sort of an acceptance of the reality of entropy.
Interesting. Yeah, I feel like I'm saying this every show. I forget what book this is, but there was a discussion about the difference in Western philosophy and Eastern philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
And like just general mindset of here, it's sort of like there's a right answer.
Yeah.
And there's a much stronger sense of like yin and yang, where two things that contradict can be true simultaneously and are worth holding in your head.
Yeah.
Which seems more useful.
Yeah.
Maybe not across the board, but at least here where
I think it's just that it's more true.
Yeah, that's probably what it is. Yeah. And being aware of both.
Yeah.
Simultaneously is really helpful.
Yeah.
So I think
we tend to polarize into good and bad.
Yeah, it's like this is the answer, and if it's not, it must be something else instead of like
not polar.
Both are true.
Yeah, I feel like yin and yang is definitely a polarization, but it often is a polarization between between poles that are both true and exist in tension versus like the right and the wrong, and one of which needs to be eliminated.
But I don't know if it's polarized, because if you think about the symbol yin and yang, it would look. I think it would look like a black and white cookie if it was polarized, right? Where half is black, half is white, instead of like they're wrapped into each other and in fact have a spot in each.
Yeah,
I don't know.
Yeah,
it's a little philosophical here, but
did you know what you were coming to today.
It's also, I mean, I have a car that sat a while, and it was sort of its downfall. And then also running it, you pay by the mile because it degrades the vehicle. So it's an interesting contradiction. And for this week's episode, I thought it would be very interesting. I've sort of been pondering this idea where we've had some really big successes, which we'll talk about some this episode and some in our practice edition. Like really big successes that have not been kind of little improvements around the shop of like, this dustpan needs a hook, or I need to sweep that thing up, but more like transformational in the whole process. And then simultaneously, we've made some really nice improvements around the shop that are small, improving an operation rather than a process, which is not transformational, is still useful, and is very practical from the reality of running a business. Is like, we do these things, we need to keep doing them. Can we do them a little faster or more efficiently or easier or less mistake prone or any of those things? And like, this show is called Incremental. Yep. Because of that idea of like, if you keep making little improvements, you'll make huge
gains over time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But then, Shigeo Shingo has a whole section on like, don't improve operations, improve processes.
Yeah.
Our quote last week was like, operation, what was it?
Operation sensitive, process blind.
Yeah, I think that was it. So, which we all tend to be, but both are I don't know, like, so I guess both are kind of useful and necessary.
I think they are, and I think kind of when we were chatting earlier, briefly touched on it. My feeling is that you have to improve the operations to the point where you can see the process more effectively, because otherwise it's just like a mess, and it's maybe impossible to kind of like pick out the stream, or what like, it's just a jumbled picture, and it's really hard to improve the process when it's so jumbled. And I think
that's a good point.
Yeah, I think you kind of don't really get a chance to actually see the through line through it all. Well,
I think that's the answer. So that probably wraps up our episode. No, that's a great point. And I feel like we maybe touched on that loosely, is like as you start improving things, you start seeing a lot more waste. And maybe that's sort of the mechanism, is like once things become organized, it is very clear how bad they are. Or something like that. Anyway, so I guess just to like dive into the specifics, just to add some color to the contradiction.
Right.
So a lot of folks have reached out about eliminating tumbling. Well, we've talked at length on this podcast.
You yourself
improving.
have reached out to yourself.
Yes. But improving the tumbling mostly. Yeah. I think it was what I've sort of talked about. And whether that's should we buy a $15,000 tumbler that's way faster? Should we buy a $3,000 one that's faster but maybe will break? Can we
have more and dump
more of
and
what we have? How can we dump them? We were down at Made Bike Show 2 weeks ago, a week ago, whatever. And Alec White and other folks have reached out over the time, but Alec White was like, you need to eliminate tumbling. So thank you, Alec. We did it.
Hell yeah.
Yeah. So, to broaden the category, instead of improving an operation, we eliminated the operation, which is always preferable. Seemingly with no detriment. Like, we've been very careful.
Yeah.
To look at the whole process and, and so I think in general, like, we need to be examining the process, and instead of, it's so easy to jump into solutions of like, okay, it's slow picking the parts out of the tumbler.
Yeah.
Why did you put them in the tumbler in the first place?
Right.
And so that was a huge win. And
did it take much work, or
No.
did you just stopped putting them in the tumbler?
We took a batch that had burrs, which is what I was worried about. There's two spots where we start to see burrs when our 1/8 inch cutter dulls.
Yeah.
So we took one batch that had small burrs, like nothing major, put half of them in the tumbler and skipped it with half of them, and then saw if those burrs were gone, and they were. So we were like, well,
the sandblaster just took them away.
Yeah. Which I guess is a common way of deburring.
Yeah.
And if you watch it, it makes sense because it seems a lot more aggressive than tumbling. I think the action is a little different because the collisions aren't necessarily more likely on the corners. They're probably less likely.
Yes. That one.
Whereas tumbling, I don't know. They seem a little different in like the scale of the collisions. Anyway, so that's been eliminated. And between that and our sewing, where we totally redid how we're sewing, basically eliminated rejects. And I say basically because when the bobbin runs out, we got to reject. So that's a thing we're digging into. But between the two, we've had days of substantial production. And then around like 1:30, Sam is like, is it all right if I like head home way early today? I'm like, yeah, like do it,
Yeah.
So just like a really drastic change in the production and speed in the shop, which is super cool. And so it got me thinking, because the other thing we did this week is Avi lent me a shear designed for rods.
Yep.
Because we've been bandsawing our blanks for the pins and then loading them into the mill and then doing a straight up lathe part on a CNC mill.
Yep.
And now that we've launched our pin ladder locks, those use a lot more pins. And so it's starting putting stress on that system.
Yeah.
And so we modified the pin shear, or I think it's called a rod parter.
Okay.
Basically, our blanks are so short that they weren't coming out. And so we were like, we could turn the whole thing on its side. So gravity made them fall out. But now we're just injecting air. And so it blows them out. Works great. But in improving it, there's sort of this background of like, this whole process is a trash process.
Right.
Like, we cut them on whether it's a bandsaw or a shear. Like, yes, the shear is better in so many ways. It's not tiring on your hands. It's faster. The parts are more accurate. There's no burrs on them. You don't have to break them apart with your fingers.
Yep.
Like, everything about it is better. But it is definitely just like improving a really bad process of then we load them into a mill, then the mill loads it into the vise and then gets it out of the vise. And it's like such a simple lathe part.
It is.
And so there are two very contradictory things of like we can't just shut down the shop and say, okay, no pins for anyone. We're just revamping this whole process. We're going to get a lathe in here. We're going to just do this right. We're going to shut down and do this right. Like, yeah, it might be better, but we'd also be out of business.
Yeah, I think that's just part of the reality of growing a business in an organic fashion is you can't do everything at once. And many of the things you have to improve in these small pieces at a time. And I think it's good to remember that these pins seem like obvious lathe parts, but also like when you and I and other people have looked online at pins being made, they're not always made on a lathe.
Right.
And you may determine through this process and through improving it slightly that like the lathe isn't actually the end goal. And probably the end goal is not your CNC mill.
Right.
But I do also like believe that this incremental step may lead you in a new direction that you wouldn't have thought of before. You know, you might be like, oh, we can do this shear operation, and then maybe we have something where it just like goes into something and gets the ends faced on a abrasive disc or something. Right. I'm just bringing up whatever. It's probably not the solution, but just something other than what is happening now. Yeah. And you might get led to a solution that wasn't obvious before to anybody and is cheaper and potentially more effective and doesn't require a big investment in a lathe. Right. Possibly. Like maybe you want a lathe for other reasons as well. And that's also something that needs to be considered. But I guess I think it's just it's good to step back and not like we were talking about earlier of us being like good and bad. Like we just want to like eliminate the bad, do just the good. Is like just keep in mind that this is on the way of developing a process. Right now it seems like a bad process to you. And it probably is an overly involved process. But it does work, and it might guide you to something that's really an amazing process that nobody's been able to conceive of yet.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I mean, also we've both over the last number of years looked at that and just run some basic numbers on it. It's a weird part because it's so low value add. Yes. That like putting it on a $150,000 or more CNC lathe with a sub spindle so you can do the backside is like kind of crazy. It is, yeah. And so I have found some pin chamfering machines, and so to your point about facing the ends, like I think there is a solution there. But I think more broadly, I like the point you made about like organizing the processes through incremental small improvements sort of cleans up the environment maybe enough where you can start to see how bad it is. Yeah. I think that's kind of interesting. I hadn't really thought about that. I was mostly this week just contemplating the two of like, I think we've started to do a much better job of actually just pursuing these more substantial, more time consuming, like real changes to how we do things in the shop. And then you do it like it's completed and it's very noticeable. Yeah. The ease of work, the speed of work, the reduction in rejects, like it's all, it feels like it stacks up a lot more than a lot of the small improvements, but maybe we've had to do, I mean, my feeling coming in is sort of that like coming into this conversation is sort of that like through building a more of an awareness of waste and more through spending a lot of time thinking about, talking about, analyzing our process, like building that culture of continuous improvement has allowed us to start to back up even a step further and say like, wait a second, like, this has been great labeling things and thinking about Kanban and all that, but now you start to really take the big jumps of like, wait a second, like starting to see the forest. Yeah. I don't know.
Interesting. As we prepare to move into our new space, I found myself very distracted with like what new machines we should get eventually, even though it's really not the fish that we have to fry right now.
Okay.
Which is funny. But I just had an interesting kind of thought last night, which is like sort of similar and like in this like stepping back and like trying to look at things a little more objectively instead of like emotionally and like what's exciting. And I've been really preoccupied with like, do we get a 5-axis mill? And if we do, which one? Simultaneously, we're getting all this like mill turn work.
Okay.
And we're doing pretty weird like routings in the shop right now to get it done. And I'm really opposed to getting a live tool lathe because of our quantity sizes and like kind of where the set, how I anticipate the setups being a major stumbling block for us in that scenario.
Interesting.
Also, they're very expensive, like all these things. And I've been enamored with this the Brother M200 machine, which is like a mill that can also turn for years.
Yeah.
And recently I've been like, oh, it doesn't make sense for us because we can't put a bunch of our mill work on it because it's a small work envelope. And yesterday I was like, I'm just thinking about this all wrong. Like, it's like right in front of my face that like we need more turning capacity. We need turn mill capacity.
That is.
Most of our turn parts are small. Why don't we get one of those and mate it with our lathe?
Interesting.
And stop thinking about it as a 5-axis mill.
So it's a lathe in your shop.
Basically.
And then when it's not lathing, it can do a lot of really cool stuff.
It could do mill stuff. But it was interesting just to have that switch in my brain, be like, stop focusing on 5-axis milling because it looks exciting and it's what everybody's talking about. And because like we genuinely probably do need one at some point. But but that's a big leap on many fronts, like programming and inspection and all this other stuff. Whereas I was real like, we need turning capacity right now, like tomorrow.
Interesting.
Like we're backed up on turning because we only have one lathe and it only has one spindle. So everything we do on it is like an op 1 batch and an op 2 batch right now.
Right.
So it's not like directly in line with what you're talking about, but I think just taking that moment to step back and like actively think about things differently, actively assess the like real situation in the shop, like looking at the jobs we have on deck and being like, oh, right now 5-axis milling is not our problem.
Interesting.
Mill turn is our problem, and right now we're like doing this crazy, we're having to like shunt jobs because we have to get a turned part onto one of our mills to get it out the door. And
interesting.
It's an interesting if we were to create a turning cell, that one of them could also do pretty good milling when it was not busy.
Right.
Would make a lot of sense.
Huh. Yeah, it's funny, like, I guess the steps that need to be taken for a small business to grow. We talk about this, but like, you can look at all the things we're doing internally and go like, wow, this is so bad isn't the word really. It's just like there's so much room for improvement here.
Yeah.
But it is important to recognize that like this did get us here. And that's been, I mean, like in some ways, if it was like, okay, back to the pin thing, not to, but like we need a lathe to make pins. Yeah. We just wouldn't have done it because it's just, a big investment.
Yeah. I mean, if you hadn't figured out what you're doing right now, you would have either had to outsource them and the cost of goods would have been too high. Yeah. And it would be a stumbling block for your business. Right. Or you would be doing them all manually.
Yeah, which we did for a while.
Yeah, which was also a stumbling
horrible.
block.
Yeah. So I think I'm trying to connect that with the 5-axis CNC.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't know. So that's kind of been on my mind lately.
Yeah, the other thing I've been sort of chewing on, and this was actually something I had written down for last week, but rolled it over because we didn't get a chance to talk about it, is just sort of like trying to sort out what my company's niche is.
Okay.
And like right now I feel like we have feet in two very different worlds. Like we do a lot of kind of relatively low cost, medium to low quantity consumer goods.
Okay.
And then we're starting to do some more like higher value tooling prototype work. And as we've talked about in the past, like the flow through the shop is extremely different. And on the one hand, it's very tempting to try and optimize for the high value work. But I have concerns about like the long-term viability of that work source.
Yeah.
Like I don't necessarily know if we can build a business around that. And so I'm sort of trying to sort out how we handle these two work streams and prioritize each of them in an appropriate manner. It was sort of brought up from an article in Modern Machine Shop about a company that did a lot. I think they were primarily aerospace.
Okay.
And they kind of had two lanes in their shop. They basically had like giant mills that did huge parts that cost a lot of money, but were slow to produce and low volumes. And then they would have like Integrex, like fully automated Integrex machines that ran low value, high volume parts. And I think they were kind of like, we don't make as much money on these low value parts, but they're reliable and they keep the lights on.
Interesting.
Sort of when the, like as a way to weather the like ebbs and flows in the high value work.
It makes me think of the difference between, like in my business, this feels very similar to, and I think there's probably a lot of actually literature in this area of direct to consumer versus B2B.
Yeah.
So for me, I can basically take a lot of my fixed costs of the business and like cover them with B2B work, which is the margins are worse. I mean, inherently.
Yep.
And so I think a lot of companies have sort of gone toward the shiny, like huge margins. You look at your neighbor who's doing it and you're like, what? I can also get those margins, and then jump into direct to consumer, but then realize like your customer acquisition costs get really high once you've sort of once you've sort of sold to the right in your face customers. Now you have to go find customers. You're on, I mean, in that case, like your, I don't know what you'd call it, but sort of like it is sort of customer acquisition cost, but like it's non-recurring engineering on a new part is really high. So suddenly, like, you can't just keep running it and keep people busy making these parts.
Yeah.
So yeah, it is interesting. It does seem like a blended model in both cases is a very healthy way of doing things, because one is like much lower risk, longer lead times. You can kind of plan it out. You can make sure there's stuff to do in the shop for people if the other stuff dries up. Yeah. Especially the like super like a lot of prototyping work, it seems like, or when I was doing that, people want it like yesterday. Yeah. Which means that it's really hard to build out a queue, which also means that you might get to like 2 weeks from now and go like, oh, no one's sending me emails about a thing they want yesterday. So we have like a week of downtime here. Yeah. Which would be really hard to, like, that's fine for me. Right. Where I'm at, but I feel like less fine for you, and a lot less fine of like where we're headed. Once you increase your spend on like employees and more machines and all that, it's like you can't just do a week of
It's
downtime.
It's even less fine when you consider like optimizing for that market and being like, I'm going to go out and buy a $500,000 piece of equipment that's specialized to handle this kind of work, and then the work dries up. You know, and like that spend is like, if you're borrowing money, is probably like 5 to 7 years. So like, it could be rosy and great for 2 years of that. Right. And then all of a sudden you have another 3 to 5 years of payments on that machine and no work for it. Yeah. So anyway, I feel like this is brought up because I've watching a lot of like my peers in this sort of like where we're at in business scale and whatnot, kind of specializing into certain niches. And I feel like I'm a little bit spread thin. Simultaneously, I feel like that spreading thin potentially, if we can figure out how to handle it appropriately, creates a very robust foundation for the business.
Yeah, you've kind of like hedged a bit.
Yeah.
Of like one thing might go a little dry and then the other picks up or something. Mm-hmm.
But some days I just feel crazy. Like, why am I taking all this different kinds of work? Like, we need to specialize.
Yeah, that's an interesting one.
Yeah, I don't know. This is a question, obviously. It seems like I come to this podcast with a lot of questions, not answers.
Yeah, I mean, like the find a niche thing is great until that niche goes away.
Right.
And so but then simultaneously, like serving everyone, you're kind of serving no one because you're not a specialist in any one of those things.
Right.
Yeah, I wonder if it's like pick 2 niches or pick 3 niches.
Mm-hmm. I mean, if you create dedicated lanes, I think if I were to change my mindset a little bit and be okay with idle equipment in either lane.
Okay.
Be like, okay, this lane never gets a job on it that's scheduled for more than 2 days runtime or something. So it's always available for short-term work. And the other one is like, well, we book this out and, we tell customers it's a 6-week turn or something if they're bringing that kind of work.
Right.
And, maybe there's some people that get left out in that, but you can still sort of like specialize, and you could even have different people handle the different sides of the business.
Interesting.
At a certain size.
Yeah, I will say it starts to become quite potent once you also build into that like bigger improvements that need to be done in the shop, because I feel like suddenly idle, like downtime isn't as detrimental to the business. Like that's what I've found, I guess, is like a funny upside of continuous improvement is a backlog of big valuable projects that sort of necessitate downtime. Suddenly when you have it, you're sort of like, ooh, this is a big opportunity.
Yeah.
And I think we're sort of getting the benefits of that now.
Yeah.
Like I sort of created some downtime for us by focusing more on product development and less on sales for a time. Mm-hmm. And that's been great in terms of progress on product development and bad in terms of sales.
Yeah. Did you actually see sales go down, or did they just level?
So direct to consumer sales have picked up over that time, but the sort of higher touch B2B sales, double-edged sword is that they are highly responsive to sales efforts, which is awesome because it's a lever you can now pull of like send out some emails,
get some work,
get some sales.
Yeah.
But you have to send out those emails, and so those drop off if I'm not sending out sort of reaching out to people.
But hopefully you're better poised now for those
we're way better
efforts.
I mean, like things are looking like they're going to get pretty busy in the next month or two with some big projects, and so and we're in such a much better place production wise. Yeah. So I'm kind of excited to see how all that works out.
That's cool.
Very cool. On a different topic.
Yes.
Well, sort of on the sales side. I've started looking at I've been trying to figure out how to systemize more of our sales efforts, like building sort of to the top of the episode here, like organizing some of the disorder to start to see patterns. And I feel like right now it's such a disorganized, not quite the word, but like I send out emails, every email feels very unique. I feel like
Are you working on a template? A sales template?
Yeah, kind of. It's just like it hasn't gone anywhere because like that's what I'm trying to do, but it just feels like every time I reach out to people, it's slightly unique, and I want to address specific concerns or like reference a conversation we had and have like a and not just like have a little intro and then a block of obvious like I don't know if that's the answer, because then also I've been noticing like when I receive, like, I feel like when I interact with a very organized organization,
Yeah.
they are sending you a lot of templates. They're like, oh, here's our onboarding PDF, and here are the steps you're gonna like.
I think it would depend a little bit on, I think it's a size specific thing, right?
Mhm.
Like, I think if you were to do A/B testing,
Yeah.
you'd probably find that your personalized ones have a higher rate of return. And I think it probably gets to a point where like at your scale, your time's super limited. You need to have a pretty high rate of return on those efforts.
Interesting.
So it probably makes sense. There's probably a scale you get to where sending out more and getting a lower rate of return, but at a lower cost to the business,
Interesting.
would start to make a lot more sense. Because I ignore a lot of that kind of stuff. Like, occasionally if it's something I'm already like really interested in or really thinking about, I'll be like, oh, I'll click on that. But
So
otherwise it's just like delete, hard delete.
Yeah. To that point, I was at I think it was Forbes Under 30 thing, and there was a press training.
Yeah.
And they brought in a bunch of these like, fancy reporters and editors from different publications, and they were talking about, they were like, hey, if I haven't replied to your email, like, I'm not interested. Don't keep emailing me. In the back of my head, I'm sort of like, okay, but if you're not interested, then I don't, like, it's not a problem if you don't answer my email anyway. And so, like, to your point, I think you are sort of part of, like, if I blast out an email and I catch like 10% of people or 3% of people at a time when they're like, oh, wow, I was actually just thinking about like this need, and then they do reply, I don't know, maybe that achieves the same thing as me sending those 3 emails at a highly personalized
It assumes
level.
that you have a list that you can blast to.
Yeah.
And that you have a continually growing list that you can continue to blast to. I think if you have 3 contacts right now, which is probably closer, not 3, but your list is probably closer to 20 than it is to like 10,000. I think you're still in that point where you need those contacts to bear fruit.
Right. But that could also point to like better top of funnel operations of like.
Sure, but that's one more thing to do.
Don't I know it? Yep.
So I think it's like yes, and right now you have those 20 contacts. You need them to bear fruit.
Yeah.
Approach appropriately.
Right.
Also develop your top of
so
funnel.
Maybe this is like the same thing as the top of the episode.
I think kind of
like you need to make sales, but also making a substantial improvement in how that all happens is also really worthwhile.
Yes.
Really hard to find the time for both simultaneously. The other thing I've been thinking about is sort of like, can I just explicitly address the fact that like have a spot for a very personalized intro and just be like, hey, see below for this stuff, and that's a block of like reference documents and this and that that answer most people's questions. Or
I've also like this, maybe this isn't the best way to handle it, but I've been really having good luck with the like question template for myself. And if you were to do that for an email that was like not something that was in the email, but something you read through that's just like bullet points that you have to hit, that it might be a lot faster to write. Like you still have to type it. That might be a great
first step.
Yeah, you still have to type it, but I suspect the typing is not the limiting factor in your email writing. It's like it's the composition and figuring out what to say.
Yeah. It also, I mean, something that's I've been noticing in my thinking on this is a lot of my internal dialogue feels a lot like our early dialogue about how to apply lean to a job shop, which is sort of like, well, every job is different and every part is different. And so how do you build systems?
Right. You're like, every customer is different and they want a different thing.
Right. Yeah, so I feel like I'm just thinking about it maybe a little wrong. Or like, yeah, I don't know. I feel like there's probably an underlying like process that everyone goes through.
Yeah.
And if they don't go exactly through that process, maybe that's partly on me for not creating that Right, like maybe I could just be like, hey, this is our initial reach out, just wanted to gauge interest, whatever, this and that.
Yeah.
If you're interested, let us know and we'll get you pricing sheets and all that info or something, right? And then they're expecting what they're going to get back if they want that. I don't know.
Well, also, like, just thinking in terms of job shop flow.
Yeah.
Right? Like, if you were to figure out a way to systematize the creation of personalized emails that were actually personalized, you know, there's you could theoretically have a way higher, like, return on those emails that you sent once you did get to a larger scale.
Mm-hmm.
And that would be really powerful.
Interesting.
So right now you sort of have, there's like the two ends of the spectrum. You have like blast template emails that no one reads or unless they're already interested.
Right.
And then you have fully personalized, written from scratch emails. And if you can figure out how to strike that balance between the two, you'd probably have like a leg up on all the other people who are only doing the two ends of that spectrum.
Interesting.
Which I think is similar to the job shop work, right? Like people are like, well, we can approach this like production or we can approach this like prototyping. And if you're like, well, actually maybe we can blend the two in these certain ways. We're still going to, you know, respond to each job as a unique part because it is. You're still going to respond to each customer as a unique customer because they are. But if you can lower the investment for each email by a substantial margin, you'd have a big gain.
Interesting.
Maybe. I'm just talking over here.
Well, yeah.
But it does seem like, giving yourself sort of a question template to start off would be a really easy way to proof it.
I like that because it's easy to approach, it's easy to start, it's easy to update, and it will be a huge help in moving to a more automated system because I feel like I'll start to build out that. I don't know, you start to, like you with your setup sheets.
Mm-hmm.
I think if you were to approach someone with, hey, can you automate this coming out of Fusion?
Yeah.
You're already well along the path of speccing that project, right? Here's everything that needs to be on there.
Yeah.
Please hit all these points.
Actually, I should just do that. Hey, Phil.
Yeah. My last topic is a shout out to standardization.
It's my boy.
No, it's funny. It is so tempting. I don't know why I think this way, and I think a lot of people do, but like, it just feels on the same spectrum as systemizing sales.
Uh-huh.
We've been contemplating how to put things in more presses, whatever. I mean, in our shop, we do a lot of pressing of pins, essentially.
Uh-huh.
A lot of it's manual. It shouldn't be manual. We're working on that. But one of the stepping stones is sort of like we overprocess by having these assembly jigs and then taking the thing out of the assembly jig, putting it into a press and pressing it all the way.
Sure.
And it's like, okay, that could just happen in the assembly jig. You'd eliminate a touch. And so we've been working on that, and I've been trying to figure out quick ways of, like, do we dedicate one press to one product, or do we make...
The answer is no.
Right. Or, yeah, correct. And so I was like, okay, how do we adjust the press quickly between them? And then I was like, wait a second. Shigio has the answer here. I mean, SMED came from presses.
Yeah.
The answer is standardize your shut height on the presses and then shim all of your tooling so that it, whatever you need to press reaches that height.
You have the unique opportunity where you wouldn't even need to shim, probably. You just make a standard tooling height.
Exactly. And so I'm just going to pick a max size of buckle.
Yeah.
A sort of minimum thickness of tooling plate that would achieve the right rigidity, and then just work off of that.
Yeah.
And standardize that across all presses in our shop, ideally.
Yeah.
But it's just funny because it's not my go-to. It's not like my gut isn't like, okay, we standardize. And similarly with like stock sizes, I think everyone on CNCs, it's sort of like, what is the smallest part I could make this out of? Because I don't want to waste aluminum. But meanwhile, you create much higher, reject rates. You have much more inventory because you're stocking all these different sizes. Then you have like remnants of all these sizes, and you're like, oh, that's an opportunity for when I just need like a little something. And like, I don't know. Our go-to is not just like, can we standardize it?
We have a very strong cultural drive, it seems like, towards optimization for specificity, optimization for specific like problems.
Yeah.
And it seems to carry through. I had the same thing yesterday. I was designing a new 3D printed tray for a gripper part.
Okay.
As we transition old jobs over to this new layout. And running through the macro, I was like, why do I have a variable for the tray height? Like,
Hilarious.
just make it the same. Unfortunately, I'd already started printing them, and I'll do it next time. But it was, same thing where I was like, why am I changing this every time? This should just be what it is. Like, don't mess with this.
Yeah, I've been wondering about that on my gripper, if I can standardize a few other, because we've talked about how many variables you actually need to fully describe every conceivable permutation.
Yeah.
And there's value to that of like not having to break your whole system to do something unusual that you didn't foresee.
Mm-hmm.
But there's also huge value in not having to break any system and having a really simple system. So both of those things. We are almost at time. I had one other fun thing, just a little tidbit. My brother Elisha visited this last weekend, and we were at a bakery, and it's just brutal watching. No offense to bakers. And I probably just, I'm not educated in that space at all, but watching it, they have a lot of room for full pan sizes on all their assembly stations, and everything is like, it seems like a very prime example of people's mindset being like bigger batches equals better. Of like, it's easier, like we're moving so much stuff. We have like huge racks of baked goods moving around, like whatever. Maybe I'm wrong. But it is so easy, and I think this applies to the standardization thing. Also, it is so easy to see the advantages and so hard to see the costs. So, as an example, in this bakery, they have room for these big sheet pans where they're doing all their big batches. Every trip around that counter, you are traveling extra distance because of the space you've allocated to big batches. And so literally every trip around the kitchen is extended because you want a tray of a certain size to sit on this counter. And it's just, that is an odd, like, you don't ever think about that. I think
we take walking for granted, for sure.
Yeah, and it's like, well, we need a big counter, and you're not like, what are the knock-on effects of having this big counter? Oh, we're walking around our big batch every time we want to go anywhere in this kitchen. It's just kind of fascinating. I don't know.
I was mentioning to you, but we were over at the new shop this last Friday. And I timed one end to the other walking there and back at a brisk pace without getting anything, and it was like 35 seconds, which is not like crazy, but if you add not brisk and doing something at the other end or getting something, that's an easy minute or 2 minutes for every trip back and forth in the shop. And as we were looking at layout, we were like, this, like, it could go sideways real quick if you don't keep that in mind.
And it also feels inevitable because you're like, well, I need to go deburr a thing, and the deburring station is over there, so I'm doing that. It's
and as you and I were talking, there's the balancing of the material waste flows versus people movement, and turns into a bit of a soup sandwich. But
apply yin and yang. I don't know how, but you should do it. Anyway,
on that philosophical note,
indeed,
we'll call it a day.
Thanks all for listening. You can find me at austere_manufacturing on Instagram and austeremfg.com on internet.
You can find me at lichen_mfg on Instagram and lichenprecision.com on the internet, and the pod at incrementalci on Instagram and on Spotify and all that.
And we have a Patreon.
patronize us.
Please. All right.
Talk to you soon.